Thousands of people are asking me how I spend my time in London City. Now that is a question.
Welcome to UWI Museum's virtual tour of the exhibition, The Enigma of Arrival, the Politics and Poetics of Caribbean Migration to Britain. My name is Dr. Shani Ropo. I am the curator, but I'm also your tour guide for today. 2018 marked the 70th anniversary of the arrival of Empire Windrush. That ship brought with it over 400 Caribbean nationals. This exhibition explores the reasons for migrating, the issues of settlement and experiences with racism, questions of remittances, and the impact of migration on families left behind in the region. Please come and enjoy your tour with us today. Thank you.
London is the place for me. London, this lovely city. You can go to France or America, India, Asia or Australia, but you must come back to London City.
When you think of the act of migrating or the word migration, what objects come to mind? Well, today in our exhibition, what we have are 3 trunks. Well, rather 2 trunks and 1 little suitcase that in Jamaican parlance is referred to as a dulcinea. If you are migrating in search of opportunity and hopes and dreams, then your suitcase, your grip, your dulcinea would have in your memories. It will have in all the things that you've put together to prepare you for this trip that may be transformational. But that same grip, suitcase, trunk can also represent despair or disrupted dreams if you think about someone who's being forcibly removed or deported back to the Caribbean. So something as simple as the mode that you use to carry your clothes, shoes, memories can come to mean multiple things in the very act of migrating. Why do Caribbean nationals migrate? Now, for many of you in school, you may learn that migration is a result of push and pull factors. For example, persons looking for opportunity, which is unemployment or not having opportunities for employment, would be a push factor that would have someone leave their country to go to migrate to a place that needs persons to work. Now, push and pull, though, is not the entire story of Caribbean migration. Caribbean nationals have been migrating for a very long time. And the migration to Britain in 1948 was not the first time that Caribbean nationals had moved to migrate there. Now, what type of person migrates? Frankly, anyone. Many of the persons who migrated in the early 1940s and 50s were educated persons, meaning that they had at least acquired an elementary education. So this exhibition explores the experiences of a wide range of Caribbean nationals and shows some similarities across the board. Why were Caribbean nationals migrating to England? Now, as former colonies, many countries celebrated events like Empire Day, the Queen's birthday, Jubilee celebrations. There was a sense that the United Kingdom, more specifically England, as the mother country, or the motherland for some people, was a space of great opportunity. It was open and welcome to all British citizens, especially British colonial citizens. So one of the things that you need to remember about this period is that while it was a time of decolonization and that there was an increased sense of nationalism in the colonies, such as Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, St. Lucia, and Grenada, in all reality, a lot of Caribbean persons didn't see themselves as Jamaicans or Barbadians or Trinidadians. Rather, they saw themselves as British colonial citizens, and that the act of migrating to England was not really radical, but rather necessary, and rather an opportunity accessible to them as a result of their ties to the motherland. So how did they come to England, or how did they get there rather? So many ships actually took people. Ships were the main mode of transportation of the time. But prior to 1948, other ships went to the United Kingdom and brought smaller number of Caribbean nationals there. However, the 1948 arrival of the Empire Windrush was the signal of the increased numbers of Caribbean nationals migrating to Britain. And the period of 1948 to the early 1960s, over 300,000 Caribbean nationals, not just Jamaicans, not just Barbadians, but persons from every single English-speaking territory left the Caribbean and migrated to the United Kingdom. One important group of migrants to Britain were ex-servicemen. Caribbean nationals fought on behalf of the United Kingdom in both World War I and World War II. Many came back home to their Caribbean territories after and actually became founders of trade union movements in the 1940s and 50s. However, still many returned to the United Kingdom looking for opportunities to re-enlist and also just in search of better economic opportunities. However, there are people who migrated to the United Kingdom for the first time in the 1940s. And what do you think were their hopes, their expectations? How do you think they felt on their trip to Britain? These are all questions that we need to consider while we think about the experiences of Caribbean migrants to Britain. Many Caribbean nationals thought they were going to migrate to the UK for a short period of time, just 5 years. So really there's a sense of the anxiety of arrival. And so many persons packed, for what they thought would be the weather, or they packed based on how other persons had told them to prepare to come to the United Kingdom. But many nationals were not actually prepared for the weather, the rain, the cold that was so different from being in the Caribbean. And many literary texts explore the experience of arrival as well as the anxiety and anticipation. So what I'd like to bring to your attention is the text Small Island by Andrea Levy, who passed away in 2019. Andrea Levy is a second-generation Caribbean national, but this text, as well as the TV show that was done on BBC, properly documents the anxiety and tensions around leaving the Caribbean to remigrate to the United Kingdom and some of the issues with arrival and settlement. Another popular text rather, is Lonely Londoners by Samuel Selwyn, who's a Trinidadian writer who had arrived in the UK in the 1950s. And each of these books' stories were not, while they may include some level of imagination, they were grounded in the reality of the anxiety of arrival and the anxiety of settlement in the United Kingdom. One of the first issues facing new migrants to Britain is the issue of housing. Many Caribbean nationals were unable to find good, proper, adequate housing when they arrived. In fact, there was a housing shortage in Britain, but this was then compounded by racism. The content in this exhibition is supplemented by oral histories. And at this top of this panel, we have the account by Roy Campbell, who said it was rough the first few years because it was hard to find rooms. There were rooms that were vacant, but you could see signs that said no blacks, no coloreds, no Irish, or you might see English only. And many of us who are familiar with this history understand that while Caribbean nationals saw themselves as British colonial citizens, in reality, For many in the UK, they were not happy to have black persons there or persons from the colonial empire. And so this racism, also xenophobic behavior, compounded the ability of Caribbean nationals to settle properly in the UK. So first, they had to find housing. Second, they had to find jobs. And as we come to look at this audio clip here by Linton Kwesi Johnson, it epitomizes the frustration that many Caribbean nationals had while living in the United Kingdom.
But if you see how me walk, you would have said me crazy. England is a bitch. There's no escaping it. England is a bitch. You better face up to it. Them have a little factory up in a Brockley. In this factory, all them do is pack crockery. For the last 15 years, them get me labor. Now after 15 years, me fall out of favor. England is a bitch. There's no escaping it. England is a bitch.
The words of this poem epitomize the struggles that many Caribbean nationals faced while living in Britain. One of the issues that they came to realize was that even though England was in need of persons to come and help rebuild the country, they actually didn't want Caribbean nationals or African nationals to be a part of the labor force. Their main interest was having other white European nationals rebuild the United Kingdom. So in those early years, many Caribbean nationals were unable to get jobs for which they were trained. Many were porters, street cleaners. They were doing any little work they could get to improve their quality of life. At some point, when the officials and government officials realized that they weren't going to get European nationals or the amount of European nationals that they needed to rebuild the United Kingdom, they began to recruit Caribbean women as nurses and provide and create pathways rather for Caribbean nationals to attain sustainable work that was in keeping with the skill sets of many that lived there. With these jobs and new economic activities, well, with any job that they had, many Caribbean nationals were able to send money home to their relatives and families left behind. This act of sending money home, that is very popularly referred to as remittances, is an important source of economic growth and development and foreign exchange for Caribbean nations. And all Caribbean nationals, regardless of where they went, whether it was in Central America, North America, Europe, England, and in other spaces, the act of sending back money home is one of the long-term legacies of Caribbean migration. What therefore was the impact of racism and struggles with employment and housing on the ability of Caribbean nationals to settle in Britain? Well, one of the issues that we find coming out of the research that was done by the team is that many Caribbean nationals never felt like they belonged to the UK. And this was partly determined by their motive. How long did they plan to stay when they migrated to Britain? Because so many believed that they were only going to spend a short time in the UK, they actually only tried to put in limited routes. But in reality, many persons spent far longer than they ever planned to be. And what actually happened is that in response to racism, struggles around housing and employment, communities consolidated themselves. One of the issues that happened too that was particularly surprising and stressful is the notion of cultural values and norms. So the notion in the Caribbean that when you enter a room or a building, that you must be pleasant and say good morning to everyone. In Britain, many new Caribbean migrants found that this was not even a part of British culture. And in the everyday interaction with white persons, they tend to limit or shrink or to just adhere to the rules that are being played. And then in their own homes, in their families and in their communities, spotlight or rather highlight positive Caribbean identity and cultural practices, thus juxtaposing it to the British norms and way of life. One of the consequences of the very early years or the struggles in the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s, especially under the Thatcher regime, was that you had a lot of tensions between white and migrant communities, not just black, but a wide range of migrant communities in the United Kingdom. And so the everyday life of Caribbean migrants was spent in navigating these cultural tensions as well as racism and various infrastructural oppression that undermined their capacity to succeed. A lot of our tour thus far has kind of focused on the adult migrant experience and less on the experiences of children who migrated or were left behind by their parents. So in this section, we think about what were some of the necessary sacrifices that had to be made to facilitate the Caribbean migrant experience. So many parents, some parents rather, were able to migrate with their children or send for them at a later date. But there were others who left their children behind. And what we found is that the experience was particularly traumatic. And even the racist rhetoric in the United Kingdom also had a negative emotional impact on children living in the UK or who had got migrated there at the age of 12 and 13. One of the Caribbean phenomenons that comes out of the migration experience is the idea of the barrel child. And what would happen is that parents would send back barrels with objects, items needed in the home to ensure that their children received the kind of upbringing that they needed. However, as children aged, the significance of the barrel diminished, and very often, in some cases, the barrel replaced the parent-child relationship. And as an impact, what we've had is some fracturing of families in the United Kingdom, fracturing of families as a result of time and distance, or rather children who are resentful of their migration experience because for their first few years they didn't have friends, or that they were exposed to bullying, or that it has skewed rather the psychological and emotional impact of their migration experience. So it brings to mind about how complex migration is and how complex and contentious the experience of Caribbean migrants were and has been over time. A question that continues to plague Caribbean migrants in Britain is, are they here legally? The British Nationality Act has been amended several times to restrict the ability of migrants to attain British citizenship. The legacy of that restrictiveness, rather the restricted access to British citizenship, comes out of a long legacy of the political practice of repatriation, which today we refer to as deportation. Historically, Caribbean migrants who fought in World War I and World War II were repatriated to their Caribbean nations. In this case, the current Windrush debacle has Caribbean nationals being detained and then deported to countries where for some they had never been before or had lost contacts with their relatives. The issue of Caribbean migration in Britain continues to be one that is a current event issue that bears serious concern and watching. So as I said before, Caribbean nationals consolidated and they spent a lot of time emphasizing good Caribbean values, but also developing Caribbean networks that were important to their survival. So they created sporting association, community association. They did partner to raise money to buy properties. They built churches. Each of these efforts were meant to provide a network of support and care for Caribbean nationals coming to the United Kingdom. Despite these efforts, however, as with most human beings, relationships developed among or between black men, white women, occasionally white men and black women. And what we found happening in Britain is that interracial relationships were a sore point. And so vigilante groups such as the Teddy Boys or the White Defense League were very much committed into having acts of violence, my apologies, against Caribbean communities in Britain. And in response, Caribbean communities were then forced to mobilize, both politically and socially, to counter the kind of harassment that they experienced at the hands of white supremacist groups. Our discussion about the mobilization of Caribbean cultural forms and communities brings to mind Miss Louise Bennett's poem, Colonization in Reverse. And one of the things that we found in documenting or preparing this exhibition is the ways in which Caribbean nationals transformed the British landscape by introducing food, for example, cook shops, and influencing the British arts. So what comes to mind, rather, is the BBC Caribbean Voices program. In this exhibition, we've included segments from the John Figueroa collection, in which Professor John Figueroa was a producer on this program, and from his work encouraging Caribbean nationals to write Caribbean prose and poetry, was able to compile a 2-volume text called Caribbean Voices. This continued impact, right, of the Caribbean on the UK cannot be underestimated, despite the current windwash generation debacle. Caribbean nationals have culturally influenced the development and the landscape of British arts, performance, music, poetry, and sports. Included in this exhibition is a film unknown to us from the Imperial War Museum titled West Indies Calling, that features Una Marson, a Jamaican who was the first black woman to be hired by the BBC. And in Jamaica, she's the youngest woman to establish a magazine, a publication, when she was 24 years old. Just to harken back to the beginning of our tour is the push and pull. So one of the things that this film does as a propaganda tool is to celebrate West Indian contribution to the war effort prior to the migration that occurs in 1948. And it helps to provide this additional context on why Caribbean migration occurred and the tensions, or rather the complex relationship between the colonizer and the colonized, and the role of Caribbean societies in maintaining Britain's colonial, or rather imperial power. Despite the struggles associated with Caribbean migration to Britain, as well as the issues around the forced removal and deportation of Caribbean nationals from the United Kingdom, Caribbean migration continues to be an important exchange of information, knowledge, and practices. So descendants of Caribbean migrants in the UK, many of them have found their own standing, their own sense of Britishness, while holding on to their Caribbean heritage. Those who have returned have invested in their home nations, built businesses, homes, done work in the diaspora around areas of social justice and social welfare. And really, this is evidence of our continued commitment and ties with the Caribbean diaspora. Thank you for joining us today on our tour of the Enigma of Arrival. This tour will be followed by 3 additional segments exploring specific archival collections on display in this exhibition, as well as current studies and issues around migration in the Caribbean. Thank you.
During the winter in Great Britain, when I miss Jamaica but a feeling. If I have wings like an aeroplane, I would fly to that blessed country again, where you get the sunshine in every day.